This is MTG Burgeoning, and in this video we are going to update and upgrade our Lazav Dimir Mastermind EDH deck. Thank you for joining us for this installment of the Up and Up series. Today we are going to update and upgrade Lazav Dimir Mastermind. Before this video gets started, you can click the links in the description below for a deck tech for Lazav, or the complete up-to-the-moment updated deck list for Lazav as well, in addition to seeing the video primer series. Today we've got some cards going in, of course, and some cards that are going to come out. So let's get right to it. We're going to take this top card off. Oh, this card actually isn't going in. It was here to prevent spoiling a double face card that's going in. So let's remove it right away. Oh, there it is. So you know it's the core is the backside. And if the core is the backside, then you really know the front side is going to be, there it is, Matzlanti, the Great Door. So here we have the Great Door as a legendary artifact. We can tap it to draw a card and then discard a card. We can pay 4, tap this, and... I'm sorry, let me say this again. We can pay 4, tap it, transform it, but we can only activate this ability if there are 4 or more permanent types among cards in our graveyard. So those options are artifacts, battles, creatures, enchantments, lands, and planeswalkers. At this moment, there are no battles in this build, so it might be a little tricky in order to trigger the Great Door. But I think we'll be able to do that just because this is the kind of deck that we're playing. And once we transform the Great Door, and plus with the built-in ability to loot, we can pick and choose the cards that we discard in order to appease the transformation criteria a lot more quickly. And once we transform the Great Door, we get the Core, a legendary land that we can pay we can tap it. That looks like the black mana symbol. We can tap it and add X mana of any one color, where X is the number of permanent cards in our graveyard. That, in any kind of deck that's dealing with getting cards into the graveyard, and, you know, we know that as Lazav, it's more our opponent's graveyards that we're trying, it's more our opponent's graveyards that we're trying to fill in, not necessarily our own. But there are cards in this build that do that for us. And let's face it, the attrition that a normal game of Magic has will put some permanence into our graveyard. And if we can get the core transformed, we will realize so much mana acceleration that our opponents may not be able to recover. So with the Great Door and the core going in, it is going to actually replace one of the lands in this build that acted not necessarily like the core, but it did in some niche instances help to build up our mana through its battery mana-like ability. And that's going to be, mana battery-like ability, and that's the Dreadship Reef. It taps for a colorless, or we can pay 1 mana and tap it to put a storage counter on it, and we can pay 1 and then remove X storage counters to add X mana in any combination of blue and black to our mana pool. So what we're doing basically with this land is we're paying mana into it to get that back later in the game. But each time we do it, we're tapping 2 lands, or we're tapping in one of our mana rocks and this land, and we're losing the ability to generate the mana that both of those permanents provide us in order to cast the spells that we need throughout the game. So, the ways of the mana batteries have gone far, far off the rails. This is not the 90s where this was an acceptable card to play, and I'm not saying it's unacceptable now. It's just that there are so many other options that can do so much better for the 99 of the build, and the Great Door is going to do that over Dreadship Reef. All right, the next card coming in. Oh, we're going to be spoiling another card, so we better cover that up. All right, the next card going in, card number 2, it is Ulon. Okay, now if you have had any experience playing against this card, and I don't know that you have, because this is a pretty, it's a very innocuous card. It's not very well advertised, but if you've had the experience of playing against this card, it can be completely game warping what this can do, and I can't wait to see what it can do in this Lazav build. It's a star 4 Crab Ooze Horror for 3 and a black mana. Its power is equal to the number of crabs, oozes, and or horrors we control. At the beginning of our end step, we exile up to 1 target creature card from an opponent's graveyard, and if we do, we create a token that's a copy of Ulon. So read this out how this scenario is going to play. Lazav doesn't care about the creatures once they're in the graveyard. All Lazav cares about is being on the battlefield when those creature cards hit the graveyard. So that's when Ulon comes in and gets to the end of our turn, at the beginning of our end step, plucks one of those creatures from a graveyard, creates a copy of itself, and then we go to the next round of turns where now we have 2 copies of Ulon, and they're both going to pluck a creature from the graveyard of our opponents, and then we create 2 more copies of Ulon, and then it can just get out of control until it necessitates a board wipe, which, if Lazav has indestructibility, is only going to make things even worse for our opponents. Ulon is going to do some very deranged and sinister things in this build, and I cannot wait to get it onto the battlefield. With this Crab Ooze Horror going into the build, it's going to replace the Nighthawk Scavenger. Now here we have Vampire Nighthawk with just a much bigger potential to have a much bigger power, because its power is equal to 1 plus the number of card types among cards in our opponent's graveyards. So, I mean, it could be like a 6-7 very easily in a typical game of Commander. So what we end up with is a 6-7 flying, death-touching lifelinker. It's a good combat deterrent. It's a good creature to send into combat where we can gain some life. It has evasion. I have no problem with Nighthawk Scavenger in a vacuum. However, aside from the death touch it possesses as a way in which to destroy a creature on our opponent's side of the battlefield to trigger Lazav, it doesn't really offer much to what we're doing in this deck from a graveyard standpoint, from a potential recursion standpoint, and from a Lazav standpoint. Ulon will do more in this deck than the Nighthawk Scavenger can do, and I can't wait to get it onto the battlefield. It's going to be something else, folks. It's going to be a great, great, great synergy, and I can't wait to play with it. All right, next up, we have a card that is... Oh, I got to see if this was the bonus card. Yep, that was the card that was protecting. So we're trying not to spoil one of the dual face cards. So the next card going in to this build, it is the Unlicensed Hearse. Now, before we start talking about this card, again, keep in mind, Lazav doesn't care about the creatures once they're in the graveyard. He just needs to be roaming around our side of the battlefield to see them hit the yard, and then we can do whatever we want with them. Enter Unlicensed Hearse. We have a vehicle here for 2 generic mana and a crew of 2. But that's not what's so good about it. Its power and toughness is star, and it's each equal to the number of cards exiled with Unlicensed Hearse. We can tap and exile up to 2 cards, up to 2 target cards, from a single graveyard. We should never run out of cards to target with Unlicensed Hearse. It can just keep growing and growing and growing, and we never really even have to turn it into a creature. We just make sure that we get rid of cards that might come back to hurt us that are already in our opponent's graveyards. And all we have to do is pay the initial mana of 2 and turn it sideways. Absolutely ridiculous. This card is going to be great in Lazav decks. Very, very great addition there. It's going in, and it is going to replace Startled Awake. Now, here what we're doing is we're slightly, ever so slightly, weakening our mill abilities, our mill sample pool, in order to include some more graveyard interaction. Because we don't want to get into a spot where we're putting creature cards or we're putting cards into our opponent's graveyard that somehow are going to end up hurting us, which is why we put in Ulon, which is why Unlicensed Hearse is here. We want to make sure that even though we might be helping the graveyard player, we don't want that to look like we're helping too much. So Startled Awake, even though it only targets target opponent and mills them for 13 cards, in a perfect world, at some point, this Lazav deck will have evolved where every single mill spell hits every single opponent. When it hits, when the card says each opponent as opposed to target opponent. That's what we're really looking for here. And Startle Awake, for me, is probably the weaker of the target opponent mill cards. So, although it can be reusable after it's transformed and getting back into our hand, I think the Unlicensed Hearse overall will have a greater impact on gameplay because we already have so many milling options. But graveyard interaction, that's where we were a little weak. And that's not going to be the case once this video is over. So we're going to weaken a little bit of our milling ability just to make sure that we can strengthen up our overall ability to close out and win games. All right, the last card going into this Lazav build. The suspense has been building. It's a double face card, of course. Well, we're going to make sure that it's no longer going to be covered up, and there it is. The backside is the true scriptures, and if you are a fan of the front, then you already know what we're talking about. We are adding Shieldred to this Lazav build. Here we have for 3 and 2 black mana, we get Shieldred on a 4/5 body with Menace. Amazing stats right then and there. Oh, but we're not even close to being done. When Shieldred comes into play, each opponent sacrifices a non-token creature or planeswalker. Of course, for us, we're hoping that our opponents choose those creatures, and we also hope that Lazav is on our side of the battlefield watching it happen. And then, if we get to the point where we can pay 4 and a black mana, we can exile Shieldred and then return it to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control. We can only activate this as a sorcery, and only if an opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard. The 4 and a black mana will not be a problem. The 8 or more cards in our opponent's graveyard is even less of a problem, so it really is just whenever we decide to pay the mana to transform Shieldred into the true scriptures. Here we have a saga. The first chapter reads, for each opponent, destroy up to 1 target creature or planeswalker that player controls. And hopefully, Lazav will be there to see it. Lore counter number 2, each opponent discards 3 cards, then mills 3 cards. Once again, we hope Lazav is there to see it. And when the third chapter of this saga triggers, we put all creature cards from all graveyards onto the battlefield under our control, we exile the true scriptures, and then we return it to the battlefield as Shieldred. And then we start that process all over again. Remember, it's a recurrent theme here. Lazav doesn't care about the creatures once they're in the graveyard, so let's have Shieldred put them all onto our side of the battlefield and close it out in one massive combat strike. Shieldred, very, very powerful in this type of build. It's going in, and it's going to replace a card with the exact same mana value, and that is Chainer Dementia Master. Here, we did have some ability to interact with the graveyard. For a 3/3 minion legend, it gave all nightmares +1/+1, which really wasn't anything to brag about. We could pay 3 black mana and pay 3 life to put target creature card from a graveyard into play under our control. That creature becomes a nightmare, and then we'll receive the Anthem benefit of the +1/+1. And then when Chainer leaves the play, we exile all nightmares. We don't really want to exile anything. We want to make sure that cards are going into graveyards from everywhere to appease our commander. And for the exact same mana value, Shieldred's coming in and knocking Chainers so far down the totem pole that it's actually funny that Chainer at one point was considered to be one of our primary sources of graveyard recursion. That is no longer the case. All right, there you have it, MTG BC. We got 4 cards going in, 4 cards coming out. Let me know your thoughts about these changes in the comment section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things Magic.